In today's episode, escalating feud leads to dad orchestrating his brother's arrest. My employer stole my stuff, so I made him pay for it. Just following orders. So let's get started. Escalating feud leads to dad orchestrating his brother's arrest. My uncle has always been a self-righteous, petty slime ball, with a foul temper and grandiose idea of his own importance but little to no brains. My dad always just took it and tried to keep the peace because family is so important to him. This is the story of how my uncle finally pushed my dad too far and ended up getting arrested for his trouble. It is pretty long since it covers several months of a feud between them. As background, my dad and my uncle are neighbors in a rural community of 600-ish people. My dad built the house my uncle lives in and sold it along with a small plot, so my dad's remaining land is about 6 acres and runs along the side and the back of my uncle's smaller property. My uncle is a dealer for HVAC units. My dad is in the HVAC business and would buy some things from his brother, even though his brother's prices were higher and he had a more limited inventory than other dealers, in order to help his brother out. My dad also rented a building his brother owned and used it as his shop/office. He only rented the building and parking lot, but in the field out behind the shop my uncle and my dad both would collect old HVAC units. These things are rusty and all around fugly, but when they didn't have anything else to do they could go get one of these old units to break down for scrap. This story starts when one day my dad went to his brother and said he needed a certain unit, but his brother quoted him a really high price and also couldn't deliver in the time frame my dad needed. So my dad called up another dealer he works with, and that guy had a unit on hand to give him for a much lower price. A no-brainer. My uncle found out about this somehow. Dudes in the HVAC business are apparently like gossipy teenaged girls, and confronted my dad, basically giving him an ultimatum that if my dad wouldn't commit to buying 100% of his units from my uncle, then my uncle wouldn't sell him anything. I already told you my uncle is an idiot. So my dad didn't say anything to his brother, but he took him at his word and stopped buying anything from him. A month or so later my uncle showed up at my dad's shop and confronted him again, wanting to know why my dad hadn't ordered anything from him that month. When my dad told him why, my uncle exploded. They apparently had a screaming match, and in the end my uncle announced that my dad was no longer his brother, they were no longer doing business together, and my dad was evicted from the shop. I will note that legally my dad was not evicted because evicting him would have required a legal notice, a certain period of time, etc. But my dad was over it, so he said fine and began converting the barn at his house into his new shop. So my uncle, who apparently had thought my dad would not call his bluff, showed back up at the shop a few days later and informed my dad that he also has to move all of the old HVAC units scattered around in the field behind the property, or he would sue my dad for the cost of removal. Now, this too probably had no legal power, since my dad's lease was only on the building, not the field, and my uncle contributed to and used the old units as communal property. But when my dad is pissed off, he is really pissed off. So he agreed to move the old units. He took his tractor over and loaded each one onto his flatbed trailer, drove out behind his barn, and painstakingly arranged hundreds of rust bucket fugly old HVAC units an inch or two off the property line at the back of my uncle's house. Note that my dad could not see these things from his house due to the way his property is set up, but my uncle had an HD view of them in his backyard. My uncle started being even more of a creep than usual, and was always spying on my dad's house, so my dad decided to build a privacy fence down the side of his property that runs along my uncle's property, but not the back of the property where the HVAC units are. The fence guys arrived and worked for a few hours before my uncle came screeching into his driveway and exploded out of his truck, already screaming because these poor fence guys had laid posts, or tools, or whatever temporarily on his side of the property line as they were building the fence. My uncle called the police, who basically told the fence guys, "Okay dudes, just don't put anything on this crazy man's property," and left. The next day apparently someone left a hammer across the property line, so here comes my uncle screaming at them again. He called the police again, But by the time they got there, the guy had already moved his hammer, so the police were just annoyed by this point, but could only warn them not to do it again. Later that afternoon, my uncle called the police a third time, I kid you not. This time he wanted to report that my dad had stolen a backhoe from him. Like one that attaches to the back of a tractor. One that, again I kid you not, my uncle had given to my dad 2 whole years prior, because my uncle didn't even have a tractor big enough to attach the thing to. The cop was not amused when this story came to light, and since it was the same cop who'd been there earlier that day, she was beyond annoyed at that point. My dad helpfully said, "Come get the backhoe, if you want it," knowing full well my uncle had no way to pick the thing up or haul it even the few feet to his own yard. My uncle replied that my dad was just trying to trap him, and would say he was trespassing if my uncle came onto his land, even though the cop was standing right there when my dad offered. And by the way, this conversation was taking place in my dad's driveway. He then said that he wanted to file a complaint with the police that basically amounts to a restraining order against my dad. It isn't a restraining order because it isn't issued by a judge, but the cops treat it that way. It's for habitual trespassers. Annoyed cop helpfully informed my dad that this would mean that even if my uncle texted or emailed him and invited him to come over to his house to discuss things, even if my dad had that written proof he'd been invited, if my uncle called the cops or even took a picture of my dad on his property, he could potentially get arrested for trespassing. My dad said he wanted to file one against his brother too. The ProRevenge part of the story is now upon us. My dad knew full well that his brother had no real clue where the property lines were and was not going to dig up his survey to check. He only knew where the lines were because my dad knows exactly where they are and maintains wooden stubs in the ground periodically along his property lines. So when his brother was away for a few days, my dad moved all of the old HVAC units along the property line over further onto his own property by a few feet and moved the stubs back the same distance. So basically it looked the same as it had before, except it looked like the property line was a few feet further back than it actually is. He then placed some random piece of scrap across the fake property line, still on his own property, but it looked like it was across the property line if all you had to go by were the incorrectly placed stubs, set up a few game cameras aimed at the line and waited. Sure enough, his dumbass brother came storming out of his house as soon as he noticed the scrap on his side of the property line, crossed the real property line to get a good look at the scrap, and called the police. My dad was waiting for them with his survey showing where the actual property line is, a copy of the report annoyed cop had given him, and game camera footage of his brother clearly trespassing on his land, and it was my uncle who got arrested. The only way his revenge for all the trouble and heartache his brother caused could possibly have been any sweeter would have been if it were an annoyed cop who showed up at the scene and arrested my uncle. But alas, he had to make do with someone he and his brother had both gone to high school with, which worked out since it was especially embarrassing for my uncle to be arrested by someone he knew well. And who could make sure everyone else in town knew? My employer stole my stuff, so I made him pay for it. I hope this won't backfire, but I believe I did not break any law, so here it goes. Sorry for the long post. Some background first. Since I was a kid, I was fascinated in computers and electronics. During school, I had no social life. I just stayed at home and was learning stuff. I was going to generic high school that should prepare you for university without any specialization, but there were few people with same interests as me, and our IT teacher was really supportive of us. When I finished high school, I already had a job as a programmer and had a few years of experience in the field. I also was experienced with electronics and even worked on a few contracts for the factory in town, involving creating machines for them. Other engineers came up with an idea how the machine will work. My job was to put their motors, sensor, wire it up and write program for the PLC to control it. I moved to a big city and started university, so I lost my programming job in my city. I was going looking for a part-time job, while living of my parents' support. Things changed when my friend got an escape game voucher for 5 people for his birthday and took me with him. The escape game had cool magic stuff, like you placed objects in a shelf and all pictures in the room fall off the walls, etc. While we were there to solve puzzles, I was mostly interested in these magic things, making theories about how they made them and thinking how I would do it. When the game was over, I saw for a moment their technical room, and at this point I was like, I want to work here. I sent them my CV, and as I was overqualified for this job, I was accepted after first interview. I was young, naive and stupid, so they just used me. My hourly rate was after tax as equivalent of $8.50. To put it in comparison, cashier at big store here makes roughly $6.50 plus benefits. First few months were awesome. I was paid for doing my hobby and the owner loved me, as his previous tech guy, referred to as tech moron now on, was, compared to me, just dumb. I'm not bragging. I swear. He did not came up with almost any original design, he just found something on the internet and was skilled enough to read the schematics and somewhat copy it. But he had big gaps in his knowledge. Once he told me that I can't build a battery-operated circuit that will be powered while the battery is charging, as this would cause the battery to explode. When I told them about charging regulators and how it not an issue with his phone or laptop, he just told me I was hired to help him and to F***ck off. Over the time, tech moron started to realize that I'm just smarter than him, and his ego could not handle it, so he decided his only now from now on is to make my life a hell. For example, the owner tasked me with replicating device that they already have in one game, as he wanted to put it into another one. I spent week just by messaging tech moron asking him for the schematics and source code, calling him, and he just never replied. Then I decided to F***ck him. I came up with an improved design and built it. When I was shoving it at the next meeting to the owner, who was very happy with it, tech moron just yelled at me for not using his design and wasting time on reinventing wheel. After some time, the owner realized what was going on and hired another tech guy, tech senior from now on, but he cannot fire tech moron, as he had all important source codes and designs at his laptop, and because of bad contract, it was not property of the Escape Game Company. Little did we know that in the future, he will not hand over most of the designs and codes, and we will end up rewriting that from scratch. The company was also franchising. We just took a game we already had running, made an exact copy, and installed it in another location. We then provided support while they were paying us license fees, usually a small percentage of their profits. The owner was a typical manager who thought 9 women can deliver a baby in a month. And it showed as the company grew. Eventually Tech Senior was made my boss as he had much more experience in electronics, while I was more oriented on programming and on-site support for game masters if something broke. We didn't give a F***ck about Tech Moron, as at this point, he just showed up once a month, did almost no work, criticized all we already did, and had working and went home. Things were going really well, so we hired few electronics student to help us. The building department, which was making props, like special wooden table that we could hide our magic into, also grew. Things were looking really good, until one meeting about new franchise client. The owner told us what he needs, we, tech guys, talked to props guys, went over all the requirements and told him we need 10 weeks for it, well 8. But we always accounted for shit going sideways, as this date will be on the contract. Usual stuff in healthy company. Next week, next meeting. He told us that the client does not want to wait, and he put 5 weeks in the contract. His reasoning was we are doing the same stuff as before and now have more people, so it will go faster. We worked hard. Like really hard. There were weeks when I just went home for 8 hours to take shower and sleep for a bit, then went back to the workshop to work on stuff. It was hard, but we managed to finish in time, and I got some sweet money in overtime. But this was a mistake. Now we showed him that what he wants is possible. So the next contract went over the exact same deadline shit. More overtime. I remember having almost no social life, just working the whole week, sometimes sleeping at the workshop, and being stressed as F***ck. Then, every Friday I just went to a pub with a few friends, totally wasted myself to relieve the stress, and slept through the whole weekend. Then comes a Monday, and we start over. Eventually I went from I love this job to I don't give a F***ck, and I wasn't the only one. Our performance dropped and we started missing deadlines. Did the owner accounted for it in the contracts? No. Repetition makes perfection, this time you can do it faster was his reasoning. And he just kept signing more and more contracts, dumping the shit on us. I remember the one meeting when he asked us about status of Project D, as the deadline was next week. Well, we did not even started working on this, as we had our hands full with Project C, which was started later because we did not finish Projects A and B in time. This is how far it went. Deposits from new contracts were used to pay fines for old contracts. At this meeting I realized I just have enough. Of course our job was not only franchising. We had our own games that needed to be maintained, and we were doing that all the time alongside that franchising hell. What was the biggest issue with all games was the control software. It was shitload of simple-purpose scripts driving all the Raspberry Pis and Arduinos in the game, but it had one UI presented to the game master so he could control all the props in game, override them, etc. At least in theory. But oh boy, it was buggy like hell. Sometimes not working at all, sometimes you wanted to shine light on object to give the players a hint, but instead it opened doors to the next level, etc. It was no universal, simple requests required massive changes, lots of overrides were not implemented correctly. One day, the owner finally agreed to my demands and allowed me to rewrite all of that. It took me few months, but I created universal engine that could handle all the shit game designers were asking us to do, was easy to expand, had error protection and recovery tasks. Now, if one prop stopped responding, you just opened the debug page and clicked restart. This was a game changer, as previously the game master had to switch off the power and sometimes that was not possible during the game, and my biggest achievement, I created easy scripting language which was used to describe the game workflow. The game master now had a shitload of working controls and option to interrupt predefined tasks and change the flow, but that barely happened, as the game was now almost automatic, and he was there just to give hints. I was not comfortable running this software on the Raspberry Pi that was there for the previous control, and I wanted a better hardware for that. My request was always denied by the owner, but the games manager wanted the new software working ASAP. To this point, we were always just testing it from my laptop, so I decided to lend them few PC. Some time ago, friend from a big corporate pulled a shitload of Dell Optiplex workstations from eScrap. They were working fine, had Intel i5 CPU, 8 gigs of RAM, decent onboard graphics, DisplayPort, USB 3.0, fully working computer. You could buy them refurbished for about $200. The company just had no use for them and nobody wanted to go over selling them, so they just dumped them. I had stack of 20 of them at home, just collecting dust. I took few of them to my work, and the boss agreed we will settle it later, so I just emailed him list of all of my HW that was used in the games, 5 PCs, some Wi-Fi routers, old tables, some monitors and other stuff I had collected mostly from e-waste, fixed it, and had no use for it. Of course I did not told them I got that for free, and was expecting them to pay me for it. Fast forward, I was fed up with the franchising deadlines, and got few job offers that made me realize my real price, and that I was abused young kid in his 20s, working for almost nothing. But I was waiting. In the next month, my software was deployed in the remaining games. Tech Moron was out of the picture for a few months now. Tech Senior had some programming knowledge, and was able to use my scripting language, but had very little understanding about the insides of the complex engine I wrote, which was now being developed for over a year. I had results, I was important, and I had demands. I scheduled meeting with the owner, where I wanted to present the list of all the wrong things, and what I want to do about it. It all came to a single argument: I'm not happy here, but you need me, so you will fix these issues and give me a raise, or I'm leaving. And I will stand my ground. Recruiter from a big IT company I wanted to work for messaged me on LinkedIn few weeks prior, and I already went on the interview, so I had an escape plan prepared. The future looked bright, and I was ready to make it happen. The day of the meeting came up. I was in a good mood until there was a nasty accident in the workshop. I don't want to post any details, as this would identify me in a second, but this even is important. I, being the youngest one here, not even responsible for the mess, was tasked with cleaning it up. I had an argument with the workshop manager about me being a programmer and not a radioactive waste cleaning lady, but in the end, I just broke and started cleaning. Halfway through it, almost vomiting from the smell, I just snapped. None of this would happen in a decent IT company. I went to my office, packed my stuff, and just sat there just playing games, waiting for the owner. When he showed up, I told him about all the issues. He argued it some, but when we got to the end, I just told him that today was the last straw, and that I'm leaving right now. I was employed as an independent contractor, so they could save some money on taxes, and my contract had nothing about my time there. I just told him that I will send him download link for all the files I have, as the contract stated that they are owned by the company. He begged me to stay for one more month, as they were behind on many deadlines. I just said I will think about it and left. On my way home, I called the recruiter and told him I accept the job and can start next month. Next day, I just made a big archive of about 150 gigabytes of files, backups, etc. that I had, uploaded it to my server and emailed the link to the owner and tech senior. I then spent the next 2 weeks in bed, watching Netflix and ignoring calls. For the last week, I showed up to help clear up some things, hand over my projects, asked about the computers and other stuff I lent them. He told they will pay for it, and then left. I was lucky as hell. The next month, the corona happened, and month later, they were forced to close all games by government, making their income go almost zero overnight. This I believe was the reason they never paid me for my stuff, even I repeatedly asked until I got tired of it. Time went by until few weeks ago, when I saw the tech senior was looking for a new job. I messaged him and we talked. He told me that they survived by doing private events for companies until they could open again month ago. All the other tech guys except him were let go, but he managed. Until he got into an argument with the owner. He did not told me much details, the owner wanted something either impossible or expensive as F***ck. When he presented cheap alternative, the owner just snapped dead and fired him on the spot. He tried to reason with him about not firing him until he can teach his successor and find a new job in the meantime, but he was fired on spot. Week later, I got a call from the owner. He hired the younger tech guys he fired during COVID and wanted me to come and answer their questions, mostly about the engine I wrote. I agreed, but as we were planning the meeting, I was suspecting he just wants me to do it for free. When I brought up the hourly rate, he just told me we will solve that later, hang up and never called again. The day of the meeting came, I was waiting in my car outside the workshop, waiting if he will call where am I, but he did not. Few days later, I parked next to warehouse where all the games were held, with a Yagi antenna in my car. Surprise surprise, the Wi-Fi routers I lent them were still there, with the password unchanged. I connected to the Wi-Fi and poked around the network. All the PCs that I lent them to run the software on were still there, still running the Linux server I installed there, and looking at the logs, they were still used to control the games. I wrote a script that runs on boot, rolls a dice, and then deleted the whole drive. I was connected to MY Wi-Fi router, making changes to MY computer, formatting MY drives. Then I drove away. Few days ago, I got a call. Apparently, when the Monday shift came in, the control system for one of the game was not responding, the browser was showing timeout. They decided to reset power for the whole rack where all the PCs were multiple times, hoping it would start up, because turning it off and on again always works. When they decided to stop trying, they find out that all 8 games were dead. The new old tech guys figured out that the drives probably died, but had no knowledge about my system, so they could not set it up. When I asked about Tech Senior, the owner made some excuse about him quitting and not wanting to work for them anymore. I told him I was happy to help. In the end, this used to be my dream job. But I now work for a big company, I don't have much time, and it's expensive. I can come over to set it up, but my hourly rate now is $150. He talked me down to $100, which was still about twice as much as I make now. When I arrived, I checked the PCs, pulled out the email I sent him a year ago and told him that these serial numbers match these on the labels, and told him I'm happy to find my lost stuff, took first PC, and took it to my car. We had an argument. I told him that I'm either taking all that stuff, or he is paying me something over $2,400. He wanted to call police, but I had the proof this equipment was mine. He eventually agreed, and I got to work. All my software was still in the bit bucket, even with the few modifications Tech Senior managed to make, alongside with all the config file and scripts with the game workflow that Tech Senior was periodically modifying and backing up, so it was pretty easy job. I got it all working and then stayed for few more hours, explaining some stuff to the tech guys. I printed the invoice and left. Tired, but satisfied. Yesterday, a nice sum of about $3,600 landed in my bank account. From what they told me, all 8 games were dead for 3 days. Each game costs between $80 and $120, takes 1 hour to finish and half an hour is needed for preparation, so there are 12 slots every day, averaging on $9,600 income per day when fully booked. This is of course just the income, profit after paying all the rent, wages, electricity, consumables used in games, etc. is much lower, but I don't know how much. Before Corona, about 80% of slots was booked during week and 100% during weekends. I just like to think I made him lost 23,000, not counting the angry customers which were forced to reschedule dollars just because he was a jerk. If he paid me for my stuff or did not fire his only tech guy, none of this would have happened. Just following orders. I used to work at GM, and we had an area behind a wall on the line that hydraulic equipment, computer equipment, and a bunch of other things that would ruin the line. There was also a desk in there, a couple of chairs and a bench. This area maintenance often went into to set down, read over materials, do paperwork, and just wait for the next breakdown. Sometimes they would take breaks in there so they're close by in order to quickly get to the next breakdown. Well, this day on first shift they had just had a major breakdown that caused a couple hours of downtime. At that time second shift maintenance was coming in and talking to first shift maintenance to get updates on the line when the superintendent walked in. Superintendent of the department came down see what happened just before the end of the shift. The superintendent was mad that he had all this downtime to account for, and seen the workers sitting there he was ticked and started hollering at them. He said he didn't want to see any more desks, chairs or benches anywhere around, and they were to cut them up and throw them into the trash. And when he came in tomorrow, he didn't want to see any more of that stuff. Like I said earlier, it was the end of the shift. The second shift maintenance worker went on to cut everything up, throw it away, and then went up to the break room, which is beside of the foreman's and superintendent's offices, for break. Seeing that there were more desks and chairs in the offices, he proceeded to cut them up in order to comply with the superintendent's orders. In our contract, if we are given a direct order, we must obey. Well, you can imagine next morning superintendent showed up and that there are no more foremen for superintendent's desks or chairs to be seen. The superintendent went off and started threatening fire him. Maintenance worker demanded to see his union rep. And when he showed up, he told the union rep that superintendent ordered them the day before to cut up all desks and chairs he saw and to throw them in the trash, and he was just following orders. Superintendent was steamed. Hopefully, he learned to be careful what you ask for because you just might get it. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.